Everyone. That was so nice to visually see how international this conference is. And welcome to this panel that is opening the second day of this incredible conference. I'm Sara Salem. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at the LSE. I've really enjoyed the panels so far, and especially the care and thought that organizers and participants have paid to accessibility and to critical knowledge production. It's really felt like such a caring and special space. And of course, it's such an honor to be chairing this panel. So the panel is entitled Embodying Concepts, and we have 4 incredible speakers. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to note that accessibility has been a priority at all stages of planning of this workshop. Live captions will be provided throughout, and speakers' text will be available on the website. Live interpretation to and from Spanish will be available during the 2 days during the Q&A, and there is simultaneous translation throughout the presentation. So this is to enable that all speakers and participants can fully take part in the workshop. So for this panel, each speaker will have around 10 minutes, followed by about 30 minutes of discussion and questions from the audience. And I'll let speakers know when you have about 1 minute left. So I'll briefly introduce our speakers and then we can get started. So first we have Alyosxa Tudor, who is Associate Professor at the Center for Gender Studies at SOAS, University of London. And their work connects trans and queer feminist approaches with transnational feminism and post-colonial studies. Our second speaker is Rosa dos Ventos Lopez Heimer, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of Geography at King's College London. Her research is a multilingual project spanning Portuguese, Spanish, and English that explores the coloniality embedded in the ways in which Latin American migrant women experience various forms of violence. Our third speaker is Ignacio Espinosa, an activist, artist, and professor from Quito, Ecuador, and their work looks at intersecting rights to the city through the case of LGBTI+ spatial struggles in Ecuador. And our final speaker is my comrade from the sociology department, Mahvish Ahmad. Mahvish is an assistant professor of human rights and politics here at the LSE, and she'll be speaking about concepts from sites of violence in Pakistan. So let's get started. I'll hand it over to you now, Alyosxa. I look forward to our discussions.
Hello, thank you very much. I just jump into it. So my presentation is called Migratism as Epistemological Concept. Recently, a colleague cited me in a German newspaper article. He deplores that I refused to see the murder of Theodoros Bulgaridis committed in 2005 by a state-supported neo-Nazi terror cell in Germany as racist. The cell targeted migrants and the victims mostly had a migration history from Turkey. Bulgaridis was the only victim with a Greek background. My colleague accuses me of offending the bereaved family with constructing the victim as white. The problem is, however, that I never talked about the case. I literally have never said the sentence that was ascribed to me in that newspaper article. I assume this misquotation comes out of his desire for categories and boxes that is projected onto my knowledge production. I do understand this need for certainties, which comes with the struggle of naming structural violence. How can we find words that are strong enough to make clear that people are being killed because of being read as migrants? However, my conceptualization of migratism is epistemological and not ontological. It is not about boxes, but rather about critically examining the ascription of belonging to a certain category. My aim is to offer an approach that helps us think and do things we were not able to think and do without it. In this paper, I'm going back to my conceptual differentiation of racism and migratism, and will discuss what it epistemologically means to differentiate between intersectional power relations and to think them as always intertwined at the same time. My approach stresses the fact that we should ground any attempt to define racism in post-colonial analysis. Therefore, I argue that it makes sense for transnational feminist, queer, and trans knowledge productions to differentiate between racism, the power relation that ascribes racialization, and migratism, the power relation that ascribes migration. Racialization and migratization are not the same, but they're entangled in complex ways, and differentiating them helps us analyze the specificities, while intersectional thinking makes it clear that they are not separate, but are constitutive for each other in many ways and on many levels. In his reflections on racism and nation in France, Etienne Balibar makes the interesting clarification that not all foreigners and not only foreigners are seen as migrants in hegemonic discourse. However, he uses national categories alongside racializing ones. I quote, "A Portuguese, for example, will be more of an immigrant than a Spaniard in Paris, though less than an Arab or a Black. A Briton or a German certainly will not be an immigrant." End of quote. Thus, Balibar states that in a French context, a Portuguese person would be more likely be ascribed with migration than, for example, a German person would, while I quote, "an Arab or a Black person would definitely be seen as a migrant." Using my concept of migratization, Balibar's approach can be understood as making the point that becoming a migrant in Western Europe relies on hierarchical ascriptions of migration. One is not born, but rather becomes a migrant through being repeatedly treated as one. However, Balibar does not reflect on questions of what role racialization plays and how it works ambivalently to migratize specific national subjects when they cross borders. It is certainly true that in Western Europe, people read, for example, as Greeks and Portuguese are seen as migrants. However, one can only claim that, for example, Britons are not ascribed with migration in France if one assumes that they're homogeneously white. Black Britons, for example, would in a dominant gaze not be seen as non-migrants qua their European/Western nationality. They would instead be ascribed with migration from non-Western extra-European countries or continents. Western European nations in Balibar's paragraph are implicitly constructed as white, while, for example, Blacks and Arabs remain in the role of the eternal migrants who can never be at home in Europe. Thinking about racism in Europe only in terms of migration and national belonging then has the effect of racially homogenizing Western and European nations as white and excluding Europeans of color who may or may not have a migration history, not only from discourses of nation as well as migration, as Fatima Al-Tayeb puts it, but also, as I want to stress, from understandings of racism. A decade ago, I first suggested to differentiate between racism and what I call migratism to analyze the complex nexus of racialization and migration in post-colonial Europe. My insistence that not all migration-based discrimination can be called racism, but that whiteness, semi-peripheral East European whiteness for that matter, needs to be reflected upon critically, has been met with vehement critique. People often bemoan that I would take away racism as a word to name the discrimination against East Europeans who implicitly or explicitly are imagined as racially homogeneous, which equals white in these accounts. It's the affective anxiety that is bewildering to me. The idea that harm is done to white East Europeans when the discrimination against them, against us, is not called racism. The idea that it was Black feminism or critical whiteness studies that had taken something away. Alina Retsepnikovska claims, I quote, "While the existing literature on racism mainly focuses on racism experienced by non-white ethnic minorities, this paper makes an important contribution to the understanding of overlapping racism and xenophobia discussed and experienced by migrant women coming from predominantly white societies," end of quote. Floria Antias and Nira Yuval Davis in an article published as early as 1983 claim, I quote, "The notion of Black women as delineating the boundaries of the alternative feminist movement to white feminism leaves non-British, non-Black women like us unaccounted for politically," end of quote. These approaches alternate in their argumentation between calling for including of white migratized women into the group of people discriminated against by racism, and between claiming migration-based discrimination produces racialization through de-whitening. They want their exclusion from the nation state to be transformed into racism experiencing inclusion in anti-racist scholarship. What is striking to me is that in these accounts, the fight for the inclusion of, in my words, white migratized positions into racism definitions, the frustration and the feelings of being left out is not mainly directed against the dominant group, but comes with envying the perceived recognition of Black and anti-racist interventions. In Retzikovska's case, it is, I quote, non-white ethnic minorities who, according to her, get all the space in anti-racist scholarship. And Antias and Yuval Davis' case, it is Black women who get to be recognized as, I quote, the alternative feminist movement to white feminism. Gabrielle Griffin and Rosie Braidotti even fear, I quote, the obliteration within European feminist race politics of the reality of racialized issues faced by women in Europe when the discrimination against East European women is not named with the blanket term racism. There seems to be a tendency in East European migrant communities in the West to express feelings of dispossession in nationalist and racist way. In the above mentioned recent piece on anti-Polish discrimination in the UK, Retzikovska mentions that her interviewees complain about, I quote, the unfairness about being victims of racism and xenophobia despite being white and European, end of quote. As seen in questions they pose in the interviews with her, like, I quote, why can't the British focus more on Blacks and Asians, end of quote. What really makes me uneasy here is that the academic scholarship that aims to point out anti-East European discrimination in Western Europe and calls this racism does not seem to have the tools to intervene or theorize the actual racism uttered by white migrants that follows the logics of claiming proper white racist Europeanness, wanting to be part of racist Europe as the Euro-American progress story promises. It is a language of loss. Before this new focus on racism that centers Black people and people of color, we were able to name the discrimination against white migrants and of obliteration even. We are being undone by Black people and people of color who define racism as white supremacy and therefore not directed against white migrants. It is exactly the questions around identifying whiteness and borders hidden in plain sight in discourses on Eastern Europe and its diaspora that is important to me here. Conceptual diversity is direly needed to make sense of the crossfadings of racism, migratism, and aspiration to proper Europeanness here in order not to appropriate the term racism from a white perspective.
Well, great. That was perfect timing. Thank you so much. And a very rich presentation. I was really struck as well by your analysis, how it touches on these questions of affect as well, especially around anxiety, around loss. And I think that that's a very rich kind of field to think about in relation to these debates around migration and racism. Thank you so much. So we'll turn now to Rosa.
Thank you. Very excited to be presenting this paper here today. The title of my paper is about, I don't know if you can screen my presentation. I have some images that I'd like to present.
Yes. I'm sorry.
I'll start in meanwhile. So the title of my paper, just give me a second now, it just disappeared. It's Cuerpo Territorio as a traveling concept, decolonizing feminist geographies from Latin American indigenous embodied ontology. Global North geographers have been increasingly interested in decolonizing geographical knowledge, yet efforts to decolonize have to a large extent continued to reproduce silences and disregard the potential of epistemological and methodological contributions from the South. The prevalent geopolitical economy of knowledge continues to privilege conceptual flows from north to north and north to south. To this end, I contend the Latin American geographical conceptions of territory, and in particular, the embodied ontological conception of cuerpo tierra, cuerpo territorio, body earth, body territory, has much to offer to the colonial feminist geographies. As an alternative to the pretended universality of Western rationality, Cuerpo Territorio presents itself as an ontological and methodological base to counter what Latin American authors have conceptualized as internal colonialism in its cultural, intellectual dimension, intellectual colonialism as referred by False Borda, or coloniality of knowledge, as referred by Quijano. The separations between the world and humanity and body and mind have been instrumental to single out modern Western epistemology. This is how Western rationality has set itself drastically apart from and as superiority other epistemologies based on organic worldviews, conceiving human nature, spirituality, and knowledge as part of a relational whole. I argue that cuerpo territorio as an ontology, as a traveling concept and embodied participatory methodology helps to marginalize and displace Western epistemology from its universal positioning, whilst creating the conditions for feminist decolonial thinking to emerge. Building on this embodied decolonial feminist ontology, which delinks or detaches from the European paradigm of rationality modernity, is a significant move to recognize the epistemic authority of indigenous women of Abya Yala, or Latin America. Cuerpo territorio, or cuerpo tierra, first emerged as a political slogan among indigenous Maya Xinca women in Guatemala, and is central to the communitarian feminist political project, as well as to Latin American women's territorial struggles more broadly. It represents an ontological continuum between earth and bodies. It bridges the ongoing struggles of indigenous women to defend their territories against extractive exploitation with the historical violation of indigenous women's bodies. As Lorena Carbenal explains, cuerpo territorio is a cosmological and epistemological proposal and also a political call to defend and reclaim the body as a territory, a base to promote life and dignity whilst resisting capitalist patriarchal exploitation. I drew on and adapted cuerpo territorio to act as a traveling embodied concept and methodology to rethink and investigate violence against Latin American migrant women here in England. I built not only on its ontological indigenous communitarian feminist roots, but also its many methodological travels across Latin America in the practice of women's territorial movements, critical and decolonial geography collectives, and Latin American researchers. Theories and concepts have long traveled in time and space, and as suggested by Said, it is important to remain alert to the risk of this becoming reified or depoliticized in the new context. In the framework of a project that moves this concept from its place of origin to another, it became crucial to attune to the new political possibilities arising in this new context and carefully considering the new dynamics at play. The operationalization of this concept and methodology required adaptations during fieldwork as embodied interactions and deep contextual challenges related to COVID-19 asked for new reformulations. We worked to a global North migration context. This concept and methodology was adapted to engage with territorialities at multiple scales, recognizing both the colonizing conceptions of territory, but also more traditional ones connected to state territorial border practices. In a country marked by an immigration regime that continues to perpetuate coloniality through border power, traveling cuerpo territorios was tailored to make space to this new reality. As women's cuerpo territorios traveled across and through state territorial, external and internal borders, those journeys became imprinted on their bodies and expressed on their maps as a state border violence in its institutional and intimate manifestations. Redesigning cuerpo territorio to travel and operate remotely in the COVID-19 context also called for greater logistic efforts and flexibility, whilst also demanding a different kind of emotional labor. Latin American migrant survivors were invited to craft their maps individually and privately at home. They were in control of their time and space, able to sit with and reflect on the embodied memories, emotions, sensations related to their lived experiences across and within various territory scales they habited and are part of. The methodology invites women to recognize their bodies as full of life, imprinted with memories, emotions, and feelings. On a body-sized piece of paper, participants draw their body silhouette on which they identify how the experiences of violence and resistance have marked their bodies in connection with the multi-scale territorialities they inhabited. Following a set of questions, through drawing and writing their memories, feelings, emotions, and places on different parts of the body silhouettes, Latin American migrant women crafted their own territory maps. A significant political process of recognition and resignification of bodies was engendered by combining the individual mapping activity with subsequent group discussions. A non-hierarchical understanding of multiple forms of violence emerged as connected and felt through various territorialities, stemming from a continuum between body and mind and body and territory as a relational whole. Violence inflicted on an external physical body was understood to affect the mind. What was done to the mind was understood to affect the physical body. State and intimate partners' power and control over transnational, national, local, home territories were reportedly felt and extended onto women's bodies. By mapping not only the experiences of violence, but also resistance, their exercise was at least partially an empowering process whereby pain and suffering, as well as strength and resilience, could be recognized and placed into perspective. The conversations between survivors brought back past pains, but were also marked by strength and wisdom, something which, as Bell Hooks suggests, may often be yielded through suffering. Based on this practical experience, I argue that cuerpo territorio as a traveling concept and methodology can be used to approach violence against migrant women with an embodied and decolonial feminist geographical perspective, attentive to multiscalar territorialities. It has shown to the potential to connect embodied experiences of intimate partner violence, structural and institutional abuse with ongoing coloniality, revealing how these are spatially registered. It has had the effect of simultaneously emphasizing separations between intimate and state violence, by revealing the similarly embodied ways in which these are experienced in a continuum, facilitating reflections on the shared systemic roots. Cuerpo territorio as a traveling embodied concept enacted as a methodology radically challenged foundational Western research premises and its universality pretensions, moving us towards a decolonial feminist direction. It allowed for migrant women to ontologically conceive body and territory as the same, making visible how state border violence extends from national to women's body territories. In contrast with the Western separation between body and mind, participants situated the mind not as detached or both, but as part of the body and in an interconnected relational continuum with all its other organs, feelings, sensations, and emotions. This mapping practically brought forward an embodied decolonial feminist conception of objectivity in research. Instead of striving for an idealized abstract notion of neutrality, women embrace their position as active epistemic subjects in the process of knowledge construction, reflecting on and mapping their own lived experiences in relation to the gendered, racialized, class-based, and geopolitically situated embodiments. Thank you. So these are just some images of the body maps that I conducted with survivors and some of the quotes during the exercise.
Thank you so much, Rosa, and thank you also for sharing those images that were very powerful. And I was really interested and struck by the many layered ways in which you talk about traveling as a concept, as a methodology, across borders, as embodied. And it gives us, I think, a very rich basis from which to think about these interests and growing interest, I guess, in how theoretical ideas travel and what they open up when they do travel. So thank you so much. We'll turn now to our third speaker, Ignacio.
Hello. I'm trying to share my screen, but it's not letting me do it. It says I'm disabled.
Try now, Ignacio.
Now I can. Thank you. Okay. Give me a sec, sorry. Okay. Thank you. My name is Ignacio, and I will be talking about the political and pedagogic possibilities of partying and marica nighttime spaces. Some of the most valuable unlearning and knowledge co-production experiences I have been involved in the past years has been mariconeando, nocturnal spaces as an artist, curator, and co-founder of Sinvergüenza. It's a collective I started with my friend Joya, and through different interdisciplinary collaborations with artists, doing DJ sets, performances, installations, visual art, and more, Sinvergüenza showed us that marica transfeminist nighttime parties can have a political and pedagogic role that allow spatial and knowledge co-production. Maricas and sexual dissidences in Avyala or Latin America sometimes talk about decolonizar the party, something like decolonizing the party. Requebra, also known as Maldita Genitalia, is a Brazilian artist based in Mexico City, and she says, descolonizar means to speak from our anus or our ass, to release all that decolonial energy that we carry inside us to liberate our bodies and minds. Un ano soberano, a sovereign anus, as Pachacuir Collective has said. A way in which Sinvergüenza proposed a more decolonial party was by hoping to co-produce new collective Marica narratives, stories, imaginary presents, futures, memories, and local histories, often invisibilized by imperialist, neoliberal, Ecuadorian LGBTIQ+ NGOs or gay parties. This flyer of one of the editions of Sinvergüenza alludes to a pre-colonial sculpture and the fact that some original cultures in Avyala or Latin America did not have a binary understanding of gender and sexuality. Another edition of Sinvergüenza was held during Fiestas de Quito, hoping to question the narrative of this national holiday, where the municipality celebrates the Spanish founding of the city, which imposed white supremacy, Christianity, and colonial gender constructions through the genocide and assimilation of indigenous people, a legacy that persists today through different modern manifestations. An edition of Sinvergüenza took place the first anniversary of the decriminalization of homosexuality in Ecuador, a struggle won in 1997, mainly led by brown trans women who have been invisibilized from hegemonic Ecuadorian history and corporate neoliberal imperialist gay narratives. We questioned the idea that maricas have in fact been decriminalized today in Ecuador, since sexual dissidences continue to be criminalized and jailed for being poor, for unionizing, for their skin color, for migrating and crossing borders, for having HIV or requiring hormones, for carrying abortions, or for protecting their environment against multinational corporations. Many maricas are therefore still portrayed as illegal in Ecuador, in fact. On Orgullo, Pride, Sinvergüenza organized an anti-marriage edition to imagine the possibility of expressing affection and care without the validation of an institution that reinforces constructions like nationality, borders, private property, inheritance, monogamy, and an historic discrimination based on race and gender. Decolonizar marica parties also involves generating vínculos, or links with broader intersectional struggles. Specific editions of Sinvergüenza touched issues like borders, together with Venezuelan immigrants, anti-neoliberal love of private property or possession on St. Valentine's, or were held in holidays like Semana Santa, Holy Week, all of which were banned online on Facebook by Ecuadorian far-right groups hoping to silence these political messages. Marica nighttime spaces of sexual dissidence can also create vínculos among bodies, building encounters and communities that can reivindicate leisure, free time, joy, affection, and care, and pleasure by dancing together, chatting, kissing, or having sex together. In doing so, these spaces must be aware about socially constructed and oppressive notions of desire, trying to question which bodies can more easily access desire, or which bodies are more desired under a heteronormative, cisnormative, patriarchal, white supremacist, ableist, and ageist system, and what role marica nighttime spaces can play in reproducing or dismantling them. Vínculos and collaborations in marica nighttime spaces can take place among marica artists and collectives beyond the hegemonic colonial institutions of creative production, like certain galleries and museums in Quito. Here is a flyer of Sinvergüenza edition with London-based collective Maricumbia. This one is with Diana from Argentina and Mexican collectives Piedra Club de Baile and Nafi. We had artistic and political collaborations with artists from the US whose families migrated from Ecuador, as well as with artists from Brazil, Venezuela, or Mexico, like DJ Guapis. Marica parties can therefore also generate geographic vínculos outside colonially inherited, imperial-serving, volcanized national borders in Latin America. Lineups also included artists from different urban geographies in Ecuador outside Quito, and Marica nighttime spaces can connect different art collectives and spaces in Avyala and beyond that also identified with transfeminist, anti-racist, and anti-neoliberal struggles. They must reflect about who they decide to give an artistic and political platform in the DJ lineup, since, as Requebra explains, DJs are not only transmitting sonic vibrations, but also a political message. Each time we breathe, dance, move, walk, and have sex, we stretch, tighten, and relax our anus, This anal stretching is sometimes conscious and sometimes unconscious. The act of conscious and unconscious stretching can involve the body and spaces, as well as practices that link both. Interdisciplinary marica nocturnal spatial production can involve stretching practices from architecture to curatorship, music, dancing, visual art, and activism. Here are some screenshots of the post-porn video art of Mexican artist and amigui Mario Mucho. Sinvergüenza also collaborated with different photographers and exhibited photographs from Gonzalo Abarca and Trueque Residencia Artística, as well as illustrations from Guayaquil Collective. We have fanzines and posters from Las Comadres, a collective that does accompaniments in abortions, in addition alluding to the viral meme of Feto Ingeniero, embodies territorial sovereignty. Different performances took place in most parties, and many times the bodies consciously dancing and moving in the dance floor, as Monica Alarcón explains, blended as performers too. As perreo artist Fernando Alcántar reminds us, marica nighttime spaces can destabilize the performativity of heteronormativity and cisnormativity. In 2019, Sinvergüenza was part of the transfeminist anti-capitalist system bloc during that year's Orgullo, or Pride, in Quito. Together with other collectives and bodies, we did an alternative walk before joining the main march, which mapped different important public spaces for sexual dissidence memory, often erased from history, such as sex work spaces and cruising spaces violently sanitized and policed by previous mayors. Sinvergüenza therefore moved, mobilized in creative and political collaborations outside the dance floor, too. Here is a flyer co-produced with Disidencias 3000 collective against neoliberal austerity policies pushed by the International Monetary Fund. Space is not neutral. It reflects, reproduces, and reinforces power relations, including capitalist, neoliberal, white supremacist, and patriarchal relations manifested in through space. Similarly, space is not inherently heteronormative and cisnormative, but rather actively heterosexualized and cissexualized, just like heteronormativity and cisnormativity are spatialized. A basic obvious example is the spatialization of the gender binary, reproduced or challenged in the architecture of spaces like bathrooms. Spaces are not neutral volumes holding bodies either. Spaces are socially produced by bodies as much as bodies are socially produced by spaces. Body and space are relational and inform each other. Marica nighttime spaces therefore are not simply empty spaces containing marica bodies. Perhaps rather than talking about marica nighttime spaces as objects, we should talk about mariconear espacias or mariconear nighttime spaces as a process, and ask ourselves, how do subjectivities create marica nocturnal spaces and marica nocturnal spaces create subjectivities? Similarly, how do wider geopolitical imperialist spatial relations enforced by organizations like the IMF produce and rely on brutally unequal, segregated, neoliberal, and consumerist-based gay bodies and collective identities that produce corporate gay nocturnal spaces and are produced by these gay nighttime spaces at the same time? To what extent do marica nighttime spaces produce and are produced by anti-neoliberal, transfeminist, anti-racist, anti-imperialist sexual dissidents, identities, and movements? Finally, spatial co-production can also mariconear theory. Organizing and curating Sinvergüenza involved urban issues traditionally portrayed as non-marica. How are marica nighttime spaces affected by private property and rent? How do they locate in the socially constructed binary of urban informality versus formality? How does urban safety, policing, and the carceral state and the war on drugs disproportionately threaten certain bodies more than others in marica nighttime spaces? How are digital apps used in these spaces related to the surveillance corporate state? How to create nighttime spaces not of safety, but of care? In terms of urban mobility, how do bodies move to from marica spaces and inside them? How are marica nighttime spaces in Abya Yala part of marica heritage? What is the urban metabolism and cycle of urban water in marica nighttime spaces in Latin America, from washing our butts to taking our HIV pills to the right for clean drinking water and appropriate sewage infrastructure to pee? What is the design of bathrooms? How are these spaces linked to the right to health in cities, including mental health? Can marica nighttime spaces contribute to healing? How do they enable the right to a city, including the nocturnal city and the right to pleasure? How do these spaces challenge urban inequalities, and how do they reproduce and reinforce them? By mariconear and decolonizar these wider urban issues, which urban commons can be identified to build alliances and solidarity with other social movements? Thanks.
Thank you, Ignacio. Perfect timing. And that was also such a rich presentation. And thank you for sharing all of those images as well. I was really struck by how, even though it's focused on a very particular nighttime space, it was so expansive in terms of bringing in geopolitics, borders, migration, and all these very structural and global questions that influence the sensory experiences that you spoke about. And I was also really struck as well by the rich analysis of how politics and economics are embedded within sensory experiences, but also how this opens up space for care and pleasure as well. So thank you so much. We'll now turn to our final panelist, Mahvish. Over to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you to Sumi Madhuk, to Isabel, and to my fellow speakers. Thank you so much for your rich thoughts. I've learned so much today. The title of my talk today is Shaur Zamir Nazriyat, on political clarity from Balochistan to Palestine. I've copied the title of my talk into the chat box, including rough and narrow translations of the three concepts that I'm bringing to you today, because they are in Urdu. Shaur, roughly translated as consciousness, Zamir, mind, and Nazriyat, ideology. I'll be getting into them during the talk. I wrote this talk as bombs rained over Gaza, as Israel pushed an obscurantist narrative, a narrative that spoke of ethnic cleansing as a real estate dispute and of bombings that annihilated entire families as defense. In the midst of this obfuscation, the Palestinian struggle answered with a political clarity that cut through the haze. Israel said democracy, Palestinians said apartheid. Israel said eviction, Palestinians said ethnic cleansing. Israel said defense, Palestinians said Nakba. This talk is about this kind of political clarity. It is about how struggles cultivate a lucid political imagination, even as they face violent state-induced obfuscation. More to the point, it is about three concepts that another movement in another site of violence considered absolutely essential to the cultivation of political clarity: Shaur, Zamir, Nazriyat, often translated a little bit narrowly as consciousness, mind, and ideology. It is about concepts generated not from the Northern Academy, but from the heat of political struggle in the global South. I came across these three concepts in a conversation with student activists in Pakistan's southern province of Balochistan. Here, the Pakistani military has spent the last 20 years subjecting indigenous Baloch to forced displacements, abductions, extrajudicial killings, and army operations. The violence witnessed a quick uptick after China decided to build an economic corridor through the province that would connect its northwest, where we know the Uyghur camps are, to Balochistan's Indian Ocean coast. It also follows a history of state-sanctioned destruction, starting from the moment that the British first appeared there in 1839, and through to a series of military operations after independence and partition in 1947. Though the violence in Balochistan is absolutely incommensurable to violence in Palestine, in Balochistan, the state, the Pakistani state, also uses deliberately obfuscatory language. When the Pakistani military clears villages away to make way for China's economic corridor, politicians call it development. The military calls it development. When they abduct political activists and disappear them for years, including many of the students that I have gotten to know over the years, they call it security. When they are faced with evidence of their atrocities, they call it necessary, and they call it defense. In the midst of this obfuscatory language, the goal of which was for states to obscure all traces of their violence, students identified the three concepts that I bring to you today: Shaur, Zamir, Nazriyat, as the ingredients that allowed them to cultivate political clarity. They would say, I got involved when Shaur, or consciousness, emerged within me. Or Zamir, or mind, is absolutely essential in our students. Or the reason our students are so dedicated is because there's Nazriyat, there's ideology. As you can hear, the first thing I did was what most people tend to do. I translated these concepts into their narrowest meanings in English: consciousness, mind, and ideology. Yet, as I continue to sit with the three concepts invoked over and over again by students facing enormous violence over and over again in different contexts, and as I continue to mull over them, I came to realize that translating them into English strips them of their richer, deeper, and more expansive meanings. Or rather, I came to realize that translating them into English works in its own way to obscure how these concepts actually chart a political methodology, a praxis that the Baloch student movement used to create political clarity amidst violent state-sanctioned obfuscation. Here's the thing. Sha'ur, Zamir, and Nazriyat means a lot more than just mind, consciousness, and ideology. Sha'ur refers to consciousness, yes, but both a broader etymological study of the term and the ways that the students spoke about it indicates that it also refers to the ability to discern truth from untruth, the ability to penetrate or pierce through a situation for the purposes of differentiating what is actually happening from what is not happening, so as to make it possible for the person who has sha'ur to judge between right and wrong. For the Baloch students that I spoke with, this included the use of a clear political vocabulary. The state said development, they said displacement. The state said security, they said disappearance. The state called Balochistan backwards, they called it their mate vatan, their motherland. Meanwhile, Zamir, while directly translated as mind, similarly has embedded within it a more capacious meaning. In Arabic, for instance, Zamir means courage and it means heart. It indicates that it's not just necessary to be able to exercise judgment and discernment, but it's necessary to show commitment to that judgment, to that ability to discern. This commitment requires courage, but it also requires heart, an ability to feel tenderness, to feel love towards that which you know to be right. For a Baloch student activist like Shaber Baloch, the information secretary of the Baloch student organization Azad, a separatist student group that's been both the most successful in the province, but also the most hounded, their entire leadership wiped out in disappearances. Zamir, for him, Shaber Baloch, who himself has disappeared today, Zamir indexed love for other Baloch and for his nation of Balochistan. And Nazriyat, which is so often translated to ideology, means a lot more as well. It comes from the root nazar, to see. It tells us that the cultivation of political clarity requires not just the ability to discern, sha'ur, and the courage and heart to stick by that judgment, zamir, but also the ability to visualize a future, I would add, after the end of violence, at that moment of sweet liberation and of victory. I remember discussing the fierce commitment I witnessed among Baloch students with one of the most public intellectuals in the area, Dr. Shah Muhammad Mari. Where did it come from, this commitment? He pointed to Nazriyat, the ability to visualize a future after the end of violence. These students have a clear vision. They know where they're going. They're marching towards a free Balochistan. I started this talk with Palestine for a reason. As I watched Palestinians slice through the obfuscatory language of Israeli violence over the past few weeks, yet again, I was reminded of Sha'ur, Zamir, and Nazriyat, concepts and practices introduced to me by Baloch students. So let me end by explaining how the Palestinian struggle reminded me of these three concepts. Sha'ur, the ability to discern, to judge, to penetrate or pierce through a situation, was on display when the political lexicon of the Palestinian struggle circulated against democracy apartheid, against eviction, ethnic cleansing, against defense, the Nakba. I was in particular reminded of Sha'ur when I saw a 1970 interview in Beirut of Hassan Kanafani, writer and spokesman of the Palestinian Front for the Liberation of Palestine. When a journalist tried to use words like civil war and conflict, Kanafani answered in no uncertain terms, it is not a civil war, it is not a conflict, it is a liberation movement fighting for justice. The widespread adoption of the Palestinian lexicon is the widespread emergence of Sha'ur. When I think of Zamir in the context of Palestine, I think about how the ability to see the situation for what it is not enough. It must necessarily be accompanied by courage and by heart. In the aftermath of the violence in Sheikh Jarrah, which continues today, in the aftermath of the bombings in Gaza, a violence which also continues, many of us in universities around the world saw how academics who have professed the commitment to decolonize, who may even admit in private that they know what Israel is doing is a case of settler colonial violence, a case of apartheid policy, failed to exercise the courage, the heart, and the love to speak in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle. They were afraid If the ability to discern and to judge is not accompanied by courage and by heart and love, it is useless and it fails to cultivate the political clarity needed to oppose colonial authoritarian violence. Finally, when I think of Nazriat in the context of Palestine, the ability to visualize a future after the end of violence, I think of a beautiful Eid Mubarak message that my friend and my comrade, the Palestinian historian Mesna Kato, sent out as Gaza was being pummeled. Hoping you all have an Eid Mubarak. Next year, we will pray in a free Jerusalem, joyride to a liberated Gaza, and eat hot pepper sandwiches on Kanafani Beach. It will truly be a party and you're all invited. It reminded me of another comrade from another struggle, Dilar Derek from the Kurdish women's movement, who often says that too many cannot envision a world after the end of patriarchal, colonial, authoritarian violence. How can we do the work to build towards that world if we are too afraid to believe in it? Political clarity is not just about the ability to discern, though it is also that, and the ability to commit and love that clarity, but about the courage to believe that another world is possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mahvish. What an amazing note to end on. And I also really wanted to say I appreciated the beautiful work that you did in that presentation to translate and to make possible the traveling of concepts without this mediation of English or the academy, which I think is also something to really reflect on how, yeah, there are so many rich ways in which we can create these conversations in which they've existed for so long as well. Great, thank you all so much. This was such a rich and generative set of presentations, and we already have some amazing questions. Maybe what I'll do is start with some of these questions actually, because one of them from Rabia touches on something that I also was really interested in and that came up across much of what you were saying. And this is this question of how the history and present of embodying bodies can regenerate decolonial tools or can regenerate ways in which we can think otherwise and live otherwise. And question was, how can we go, or how can this go against the formal canon of space? And I know many of your talks talked about space and how it's traditionally imagined versus either through the spaces you look at or the concepts you're thinking with. You really give us so much to think with in terms of space itself and mapping, counter mapping, and so on. And so I was wondering if this would be something you could speak to, and in particular, how this idea of movement, of traveling, not only of theories and concepts, but also of feelings, of emotions, of solidarities, of different words themselves, how this makes possible as well a very different imagining of space that, again, is not simply confined to the nation or even to the global, but also includes cosmological ideas of space and very different ontological ideas. And the other question I had that was a bit related to this is this idea of time. So I was really struck by, in all of your presentations, that there was always a focus somehow on feeling, on sensory experiences, on the bodily and so on. And to me, this made me think a lot about how it also gives us a very different understanding of time and how time is felt or time is experienced, that also moves us very far beyond the linear kind of notion of time that is also quite dominant, and its relation to space. So I was wondering if this is something that you're thinking about, the question of how these analyses also produce a different idea of time, produce different feelings of time, and how even this idea of the future then becomes something not in the far away kind of distant future, but something that is also possible in the present, in these kind of fleeting moments and spaces. So those were my kind of two broad questions, but feel free, of course, to ignore them. And if it's okay, I can also add two of the earlier questions that came in. So one was for Alyosxa from Teresa. And Teresa asks that how might we then conceive of the systemic marginalization of Eastern Europeans beyond the context of migration. And they speak particularly to how might we make sense of the structural devaluation of Eastern European scholars and theory within Western dominated academic structures and scholarship. This was the first question, and the second question I'll include here, and we'll of course have another round, is to Rosa, which comes from Flavia. She says, her presentation was amazing, and I was wondering if you see any difference between applying the decoloniality method that comes from the modernity coloniality school in Latin America and the decolonizing method that we can find in feminist geography concepts. So yeah, maybe we can start with that round and we'll come back. They're all coming in now, so we'll come back to some more later. So maybe we could start with Alyosxa, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you for the questions. I think that's a lot of questions, Sara, that you opened up here, and I will go to that question on the marginalization of Eastern Europeans and Eastern Europe, and I think that's a very important question. And I think what I'm concerned with is as I said, the anxiety of like being, if we don't call it racism, the discrimination doesn't happen. We don't have any words for the discrimination that happens, right? And I think it is possible to talk about discrimination without calling it racism, right? Because we do that all the time, and I think that is very important. And I think that definitely within Western Europe, Eastern European knowledge production, epistemic production is marginalized and is invisible. But I think what I'm concerned about is then to say that to claim this, to complain about this invisibilization at the cost of Black feminist scholarship or at the cost of post-colonial scholarship, right? And say, why is post-colonial scholarship seen within Western Europe, within white Western Europe, and why is Eastern European scholarship not seen, right? And so I think this is like, this has several problems, right? Because it addresses not the center, it as culpable, right, for the invisibility of Eastern European scholarship, but it addresses the perceived, the phantasmatic dominance of post-colonial and anti-racist scholarship, which is of course phantasmatic, and that's a racist idea, right? So I'm not saying that this was in the question, right? I think the question is really important, but I think there is the danger, and people do it all the time, of reproducing this problem. But I think definitely one can talk about the, for example, Manuela Botka is a scholar who talks about Eastern Europe as the aspirants to proper Europeanness, right? And talks about how Eastern Europe and how Southern Europe have become this kind of, during history, this kind of like semi-peripheral European spaces, in which Southern Europe is the nostalgic Europe that had the empire and lost it, right? While Eastern Europe never had the empire in certain ways, right? But this, you can see that here we describe these the semi-periphery within Europe through post-colonial analysis, through decolonial analysis, through the relation to wanting empire, right? And I think this is really important not to lose that. And to when we speak of a hierarchization within whiteness and a hierarchization within Europe, to still speak about racism, empire, and the white supremacy and the desire for white supremacy at the same time, and also not to make the mistake that we think Eastern Europe is all the same and it's only white, because obviously Eastern Europe is not only white, and there is a diversity within European nations, like in all nations. And so I think the equation then with the Eastern Europeanness as whiteness is also quite problematic, if that makes sense.
Thank you so much. Rosa, I don't know if you'd like to come in next.
Yeah, sure. So responding to, I think it was Claudia's question. So yeah, I don't know if I would say, yeah, there are differences, but in my work, what I'm trying to do is to use these different theories and literatures complementary. So the MDC theories, the colonial feminists from Latin America, but also feminist geographers, Anglophone feminist geographers, but in particular in relation to space and bodies. In terms of feminist geographers, I think there is a lot of work already on embodiment and thinking, sensations and feelings on the bodies. But I think the main difference in bringing in body territory, these indigenous concepts, is in terms of really understanding body and space, body and territory as part of a relational whole. So instead of thinking about just the effects of one on the other, actually thinking them as ontologically the same. And I think so, and then that brings that can bring different concepts in terms of coloniality from the MDC theories with like also geography, feminist geography methodologies. So body mapping is already like a methodology that is widely used, but I differentiate that from the body territory mapping methodology because it's really trying to challenge this idea of body and mind as different and body space as separate, and bringing them together. So I guess that would be the sort of like the main difference, but they are not, I don't feel they are opposed. It's just a different way of understanding and feeling. And that was something that resonated a lot with the participants of my research. And I also wanted to use the concept of body territory with this idea of traveling, like women are traveling from Latin America to here, and why, like research on migration and migrant women are still using Western concepts, right? So we should maybe try to use concepts that are actually a little bit more similar to their experience, even though, you're talking about, like indigenous, Black, mestiza women, so they're not necessarily they not necessarily are working with this concept, but it was interesting to see that the concept really deeply resonated with the understanding of like bodies, of nature, of like minds as connected and as part of the continuum. And the first and the two broad questions that you pose, I think definitely through bodies we can rethink space and time, and especially like coloniality. I think we can see how this continuum of coloniality through time by looking at the bodies, like through time and space, and that's what I'm trying to do by really focusing on the body as the first scale.
Thank you, Rosa. So we have a few more questions, but I don't know if Mahvish or Ignacio, if you want to come in on any of the questions so far, the question around space or how these types of decolonial concepts might change the way we approach space more generally, which I think especially Ignacio's presentation spoke so richly to.
I couldn't hear that well. My internet was not working that well in the first question, but I did hear the second question better in terms of time. And obviously, nighttime spaces have this, as the name says, that connection. And well, in terms of time, I was recently there. Right now, there's much more consciousness in terms of because of the pandemic, So before the pandemic as well, there were these protests in Ecuador against the IMF, very badly. There was a lot of violence from the state to stop them, and there was this graffiti that comes to my mind right now that said, "Feminized bodies always had curfew." So in terms of at what time we go out, who is able to go out in the city, in urban space. Right now with the pandemic, there's this restriction, which is a form of control. And usually the night is seen as this dangerous space where there's illegal activities for sex, for prostitution, for different things that are associated. And it's the night, this time spaces at night, so spaces at specific times, are more acceptable to be policed, to be regulated, to be controlled by governments. And obviously right now, with, as I was saying, with the pandemic, this has really shifted, or maybe this has even normalized, has become normalized. Why is there a curfew at a specific time at night? And how has this curfew really, well, it's really implemented right now, but in other ways has been, in practice, always existed. So I don't know if those are some ideas that are kind of floating in my head that might be kind of relevant or interesting.
Thank you so much. Mahvish, if you want to add anything, or we could turn to some of the audience questions.
I can add a short
Yes.
comment. Just listening to all three of my panelists' really rich presentations. I was thinking about around the question of space and affective solidarity, which I think you mentioned, Sara. There is something about how so much of even our decolonial conversations can still inadvertently orient itself or recenter the global north, because it's constantly in response to that. It's response to that hegemonic violence. And I think that, when Alyosxa, I hope I said that correctly, really interestingly talked about the marginalization of Eastern European, seeing itself as pitted against post-colonial anti-racist theory. Again, both of these sets of theories seem to orient themselves, constantly towards the global north, and rather than towards one another, or different sets of global south theories, south-south sort of conversations can become quite difficult. And Rosa's point about how so much of migrant study still uses concepts, that are generated from the global north instead of these concepts elsewhere, not just from the sites that she was talking about, but lots of other sites as well around the world. I mean, there's an interesting kind of division between people who study, for example, if I think about Pakistan, people who study Pakistan and people who study Pakistani migrants. They don't cross over. Right, they're completely different sets of academic inquiries. You don't have people who know migrant studies, people who also know the quote unquote countries of origin very well. So there's kind of an orientation thing. And just to add with the affective solidarities, I think it's been political movements and the pedagogical practices that they have engaged in that has actually generated South-South solidarity. So the Palestinian struggle has, of course, done so much political labor, not just in the global north, but in South Africa, in Pakistan, in India, in educating people about a political lexicon and a vocabulary, as has the Kurdish movement, did the anti-apartheid movement. They do it because they need it desperately. So it comes also from that space. And I think Zapatistas as well, probably.
Great, thank you so much, Mahvish. I'll turn now to some of the audience questions for Ignacio and Mahvish. So from Janice to Ignacio, he says, thank you so much for this wonderful and interesting talk. And they say that I find it really important to radically focus on the anus as an opening and as deconstructing the patriarchal and phallic heteronormative white supremacy. And their question is, is there any literature available on the concepts that you use in your talk? If that could be shared. And for Mahvish, we have a few questions, so I'll try to bring them together. So the first one is from Aicha, who asks, how do we avoid in our methodologies an extractive relation to social and political movements that we study in the academy as a site of knowledge production? Sayeda asks, how does the erasure of the oppressed's language operate with its obfuscation? Do they work in progression, like some of the linguistic stages of resistance to violence, or do they work in tandem? To explain, we've witnessed this obfuscatory language in the discourse around Israel's settler colonialist violence, especially recently. However, as a Pakistani, it seems that for Balochistan, the languages of the oppressed are more erased than obfuscated. Baloch experiences of violence are invisible, in some ways akin to the Palestinian experience, but in other ways very different. Would love to hear your opinion on this. And finally, from Rabia, she says that how is it possible for students and academics to redefine the concepts that you talk about? How might we make spaces for maybe a repository of such concepts, and how does this look like as well within political science in Pakistan? It was awesome listening to you. So, Mahvish, would you like to go first?
Sure, I wish I had like a moment to just think through the really rich questions. Thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to try from one end. So the question of how do we avoid extractive relationship is one that comes up quite often, and it's an interesting one because on the one hand, it also perhaps behind that question can obscure a tendency to actually divide knowledge into knowledge that is extracted and knowledge that's in the academy. So there is an assumption of a division. I mean, often that's my first sort of answer. The second one is that I think that there are some very, very interesting reflections, especially I think the two sets of theories that have helped me think about that is Black radical theorists and indigenous feminists, especially indigenous writings by people like Eve Tuck and Wang or like Audra Simpson, who talk about the necessity of ethnographic refusal and the necessity of refusal within research. So there are certain things, precisely because you're not just, the question isn't just of bringing knowledge in and not retaining a relationship. It comes embedded out of a relationship with that movement that goes beyond the academy, and a relationship of reciprocity and obligation with that movement, which means that certain things that the academy sometimes requires, like complete transparency, always being open, always outing who it is you talk to, always having everything on your ethics forms and so on, cannot be adhered to. And Audra Simpson especially speaks about how there were certain things that she knew not to ask about and certain things that people knew not to talk about, but they both knew what those things were. And you all know what it is that you don't introduce into the academy because of the dangers that it poses, because of the sets of conversations that are necessary not to bring in. So I think that one of the ways is to avoid that extractive relationship is to maintain an actual relationship, to maintain a relationship that is not extractive, one that where you also consider yourself as one part of a larger, either as an ally or in solidarity, and not just as an isolated, ivory tower academic, but as part of movements, and reject the divisions that the academy imposes, both on knowledge, but also both on what counts and does not count as knowledge, but also on the institutions, and be, of course, very aware of what kinds of power and influence that you carry with it. But the other part of this that's quite interesting is that extractive relationships are already deeply embedded in how global North theories operate. And so it's not like now we will suddenly become they're already very much there. And then I think it's also about outing the ways that they already function within the academy. Like take something like anthropology, which for a very long time operates through introducing terms like taboo or mana, there's all of these kind of things. And I think there's a David Graeber text from a while back where he talks about those terms. Anthropology has a very long history of doing that extraction, but without a relationship to movements, without a relationship to communities, and without a sense of obligation to what must not be brought into the academy. And I think by bringing movements more central, you also acknowledge that you have a relationship that has other sets of obligations. In terms of I hope that, but I can also speak more about it. In terms of please, Sara, cut me off if my answers are too long. Let me do the last one. How do we, I just have to read the question again. So if you want to.
Okay.
Yeah, can I take a moment just to read them? Thanks.
I don't know, Ignacio, if you want to come into this question about is there writing or literature about these concepts, or if you could speak more to the concepts and the work that's being done around them. I think you're on mute still.
Sorry. So the person also mentioned Paul Preciado, but honestly, with my ADHD, sometimes for me, one of the most useful ways of getting knowledge is also from YouTube videos, from podcasts, and Requebra has a podcast. She explains her experience of the body in terms of perreo, which is like dancing, kind of like this dance in with different, very long historical contexts in Latin America. And there's this podcast called Descolonización, which is part of her whole notion, and you can find it on Spotify. And then, the person was also asking in terms of, I don't know where the question is again, but something like opening, the anus as this opening. And I am not sure if I perceive the anus as this opening between the body and space. I think that's more the skin. Actually, I think the anus is kind of like sometimes the opposite, although there's these other conceptions, but the anus is also skin, and it's made of skin, and very sensitive skin, in fact. Actually, very like some tissues from the anus beyond the prostate, or for bodies that have prostate, have already a capacity, and some bodies argue that orgasm just through these more sensitive tissues. So that skin that differs in the body, I think, is more the connection between the body and space. That the anus sometimes as the organ is more understood as kind of like holding something inside, and can kind of represent the opposite, holding objects, holding food, shit, inside, and then outside. So it's kind of like the opposite. Meanwhile, skin is what I think really reflects these connection between body and space, and this relation of how the two things are connected. I will read a little quote from this writing that Mónica Alarcón, who does philosophy in the dance, she recently died with cancer, and she quotes, "La piel se distingue de los otros órganos especiales del sistema nervioso, los ojos, oídos, nariz y boca, en un aspecto importante. Percibe ininterrumpidamente su entorno, media entre interior y exterior, no se cierra. Esa constante percepción sensorial es necesaria para el desarrollo del sentido de continuidad de sí mismo. No solo con él puede desarrollarse un ego estable y adaptable. La piel percibe tanto esa continuidad como los procesos de cambio que enfrenta sin cesar momento a momento." The thing is, so it's the skin what kind of like connects us. It's in our body, but what we touch. So I'm touching right now the screen, an object, or the table, or the wall right now. And these spaces kind of like the skin is what connects my body with space. And if we understand body as space in a certain way, also the anus is able to connect with other bodies and other spaces in certain ways. Because it has skin, it's made of skin as well. So that's something that could be interesting to argue. And then, touching, sometimes if we also touch, so there's this, Mónica Alarcón also talks about this double sensorial feeling. So one thing is when you touch the screen, the wall, the floor, but then when you touch your own hand, for example, there's this double sensorial thing of like, I'm feeling that what I'm touching, but at the same time I'm touching an object. So I think the anus made of skin tissue is what connects us with inside and outside from my perspective.
Great, thank you so much. Mahvish, back to you.
Thank you for giving me a moment just to reread the rich questions. I'll try to be really short. The question, wonderful question by Sayda Halima Hassan about the stages of language, or how does the erasure of the oppressed's language operate with its obfuscation? I think there's a couple of things. They point out, Sayda Halima, that Baloch experiences of violence within Pakistan are invisible. This is partially true. They're invisible outside of Baloch communities, but they're not invisible within them. They're also not totally invisible within other minoritized and racialized and attacked and targeted communities, all of whom do know and have learned and have longer histories of solidarity and alliance with them. So they're partially erased, obviously by the government and the state, but not within these longer histories of community memory and political memory, the kind of political memory that gets handed down through generations, not through the school, but in families, despite the attempt by states and schools to make them disappear. I think there's ways that communities that have been targeted find methods to retain political memory and also political memory of alliances. The second thing which I think is really interesting is how does a community like the Baloch or any other community, so in that particular instance, what I can say is that that specifically the Baloch community, which nobody knows about, right? Really, about what's happening in Pakistan. What you have happening in terms of the kind of language that gets employed by, for example, huge parts of the Baloch movement is at the very first instance a feeling that one must adopt a language of human rights or a language that is legible to the world, and so they feel forced to do that. Which is really unfortunate, but which means a necessity to sort of shut down other forms of languages that they might already use. But that's in an attempt to make the atrocities legible to a global community. The problem is, of course, that language and the institutions that it turns towards is itself quite limited and has been unable to address the violence that's going on. The other thing that is also attempted to do is a borrowing of radical language from other parts of the world, right? So saying things like Baloch lives matter, or things like Bramsh is who's this girl who was shot at, Bramsh is the Malala of Balochistan, to borrow. So there's a borrowing of political languages, much like Palestine borrows apartheid or anti-apartheid in order to make certain things legible. And I think that kind of borrowing of political language has its own kinds of stickiness and problems, but also the opportunities for rendering or making the situation legible, not through a human rights lens, but through other lenses. And then, of course, there's the organizing that they do, that people do among themselves, where there isn't this holding back, there isn't this attempt to make oneself legible, but the use of various kinds of indigenous vocabularies and languages. Finally, in terms of, very quickly, like in terms of how do you do that within the Pakistani academy, given the huge amounts of crackdown happening, which happens to many friends who are professors and lecturers, and many friends who have been fired or pushed out, is one of the as a final note, now I'm at LSE, but I used to teach in Lahore, I used to teach in Islamabad, and one of the things that I've always noticed very, very strongly is how separated the university is here from its immediate environment, right? In a way that it isn't in Lahore. Even Lahore, which is a private university, wasn't separated, and Quaid-e-Azam University, public university, wasn't separated from its environment. So you are already, as an academic, engaging in extra academic spaces. You're holding study circles outside in the gardens. You're finding other spaces and forums of debate and conversation. So these kind of things, like, I mean, these three concepts weren't just, they're very widely used concepts, and also in political movements within Pakistan. Communists use them, lots of other people also use them. And I can't think of a single sort of, at least many of my academic friends in Pakistan who don't always also necessarily engage in public debate in a way that isn't totally necessary in the neoliberal academy in the North, where it's so separated. It's quite hard to get one's head around that here sometimes.
Okay, thank you so much, Mahvish and Ignacio, for those answers. And I'm afraid we're out of time, but that was the Q&A also brought up so many other questions, and it was very, very rich. So I'll just end now by saying thank you so much to the speakers, to the questions, to the organizers. This was incredibly rich, and I think will leave us with so much to think and to think and continue working with. So thank you all so much, and I hope you have a great rest of the conference, and thanks especially to the organizers. Thank you.